Hello, welcome to another episode of Frontline Conversations. Today we have a first time author, Manuraj Shunmugasundaram, who has written a book, The People's Sanctum. Now, Manuraj is a politician. He is also a lawyer who practices both in the High Court and the Supreme Court. And now he has become an author. The book is about the 100-year struggle to democratize temples in India. Let's ask Manu the reason why he wrote this book and what is the main purpose of the book itself. Good morning, Manu. Thank you for meeting us at such short notice. So let's ask you the first questions first. Why the People's Sanctum and why now?
Well, as the saying goes, the best time to do anything was 20 years ago, but the second best time is to do it now. I wrote this book mainly because I found the story of the anti-caste movement told through the lens of temple entry fascinating. The devastating impact that caste has had on Indian society, I don't need to explain in great detail, but the surge of a indigenous political movement in response to the caste hierarchical structure, and coming with it a fight for equality which began at the gates of the temple was something I thought has to be told. It also so happened in 2024, the chief ministers of Tamil Nadu and Kerala at that time, which was Mr. M.K. Stalin and Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan, they met at this wonderful little town called Vaikom, and they inaugurated a museum, library and a memorial to the 100th year of the Vaikom movement. Now, we have all heard about it in passing references, but when I went to Vaikom and witnessed the amount of deep history, I found there possibly the very first people-led South Indian Satyagraha in the country. It began in the year 1923, primarily led by leaders of the Kerala Congress, Madhavan, Kesava Menon, Barrister George Joseph and others. And then it also gained nationwide attention.
Yeah.
So my book, the story it tells, begins in Vaikom and then traces the 100 years since, which is why, it was published in 2025.
Yeah, social justice through, say, temple entry or access to the paths around the temple. That's actually very fascinating. And it's actually in the fringes of the entire caste dialogue, social justice dialogue itself. So, is that one of the reasons why you wanted to front and center this to say that, okay, there is a problem here too, and we need to also look at this?
So temples provide a sort of an unquestioned authority, and this is not my words. It is, I believe, the view of people like Periyar and other Sri Narayana Guru and many other social reformers who found that religion sanctions caste. Ambedkar, to a point, lamented that without attacking religion, how can you solve the caste hierarchical structure, right? So this place where they got this unquestioned authority for caste structure was temples. So therefore, for me to go to the heart of the place of the anti-caste movement was something which I found to be a very enriching experience. So temple entry also provides an interesting view because it not only involved social and political movements, which I said were, Periyar, Ambedkar, Kesava Menon, Madhavan, many others, but also interesting legislative insights. So for example, the Justice Party in 1922 brought the very first ever Hindu Religious Endowments Bill, a law to give government oversight over temples. Okay. And then over the years, we also saw a number of judicial battles. So cases involving different communities saying one community could not come into the temple or one community could not become a priest and so on and so forth. So I could also weave in the judicial developments, legislative developments, in addition to political developments. So I found in it a composite story. Though temple entry is often just seen as a social political movement,
Correct.
it has great, I would say, resonance even in judiciary.
Okay, lovely. So let me just go to the temple and the construct of it itself. You say you quote an associate professor Mavali Rajan saying that the people in early medieval South India considered that a place without a temple is not fit for human habitation. Is that a kind of rephrasing Manuvad or the Manu's principles of how caste and how hierarchical a society should be? Does it draw on that at all, or is it a completely different thing that without God or without temple you don't exist, or the habitation doesn't exist?
Uh, I merely wanted to state the unimpeachable significance that temples have in our society, and this goes back 1,000 years. And essentially, the word koil, the Madras University lexicon tells us, is formed of two subwords. Ko, which is to mean the great person, ruler, or a king, and il, which is short of illam, which is,
Mm.
in the
House.
Dravidian
Yeah.
languages, it is the place of being or home. So, in a sense, often temples were almost within the presence of a palace or a kingdom. And over the years, many historians and researchers, including Anirudh Kanisetti, Manu Pillai, and others, have studied the importance of temples, right? So much so that Cholas patronized temples to a great extent, and partly that was because they found that through temples, beyond religion, they were cultivating a group of people who would be extremely loyal to the king. And through by almost restructuring the king as a avatar or as a form of the
Mm.
uh,
Almighty.
Lord Almighty, you could also, tell the people that they have to be extremely loyal, obedient, and faithful to the king itself. So that kind of intermingling was
Mm.
hard to, unravel. And temples have become part of, life. But however, it is not that should provide anybody with a unquestioned authority to discriminate, right?
Mm.
And often the subtle difference that I have tried to draw through this book is you can still be religious if you choose to, without having to swallow everything that religion says, especially discriminatory practices like caste or gender based practices.
And you make a case for state control of temples from the Chola time onwards, and that's a huge discussion now. I think kind of muted now in Tamil Nadu, but generally it's a discussion now when the DMK was in power in Tamil Nadu as well. Since you trace this, what is your view on where the temple should be located? Of course, as a party, you would definitely say it has to belong to the state. But having studied the nature of temples, the way they were governed, and all of that, do you think a Chola kind of thing would be better where the state is in control or the community owning it, which in its own way, it's extremely attractive, right? I mean, the community around the temple owns the temple kind of thing. Which would you prefer as a scholar, not as a politician?
At the heart of the book
Huh.
is the contrast between Western notion of secularism and what I call the Madras model of secularism. Okay, and through this, I've come to a conclusion after reading and trying to research into how India has evolved its own type of secularism. The standard Western notion of secularism, as everybody knows, they will give you a common line which says the state and church should never meet. That is, the state, which is the government, should do its own, be in its own realm, and the church or the religion, the religious authority should have nothing to do. There should be no overlapping. But starting from the Chola period all the way to the British rulers, we had a great deal of what I would call sovereign sanctum involvement. Okay, the sovereign rulers always interfered in temple matters. In fact, it was the Cholas and after that the Vijayanagara rulers who endowed vast amounts of land and property, gold, to temples. So today, when you see even the massive dams in Tiruchi, Tanjavur, which we are famous and we are very proud of, they are all built actually through the temple. In fact, temples were the sites of the very first public-private partnerships in South India. Now, coming all the way to the British time, right? This is where it gets very interesting. Initially, the East India Company was ruling the British Raj, and then by the time it changed over to the British colonial government, there was an interesting incident in the Sepoy Mutiny. When Indian sepoys, the soldiers, they put their weapons down because they were laced with beef and pork fat, right? This is what we all know. And at that time, Queen Victoria issues a proclamation and says, from now, she and her representatives in India will not get involved in the religious affairs. The pushback for that came from the local British governor generals and governors here, saying we should not do that because these temples are endowed with tremendous assets. We should not give it up so easily, because by then the British had set up an entire mechanism to extract revenue from temples and other religious endowments. Okay, so the continuous involvement of the sovereign even survived through the British era all the way till 1920, and this is where the first ever indigenous legislation was passed. The Justice Party, a party which I consider to be a precursor or a forerunner of the Dravidian movement and the DMK and ADMK today, they came to power in 1920-21. One of the first legislations they introduced was the Hindu Religious Endowment, wherein they say specifically for the reason that to take these temples away from the control of one community, we would like to place it under government control. And now this has been, whether we support it or not, whether we agree with it or otherwise, this has been the way that Tamil Nadu and most of, I would say, Madras presidency has dealt with it. And because of this, we have ensured that there is equality, there is a semblance of fairness within temples, all the way, not just from temple entry movements, but all the way today to where we are discussing about how priest appointments should be fair, right? And for the first time in Kerala in 2018 and in Tamil Nadu in 2021, they appointed non-Brahmin priests called archakas or so priests in these temples, which itself is something I would say extraordinary and nothing short of revolutionary. But I think we have lost the significance of this because this is somewhat only confined to the southern 5 or 6 states. So my view about in this book, which I've tried to explain, is this Madras view of, or Madras school of secularism, which says that you are allowed to practice your own religion and the state should not actually promote or endorse any religion, except that the state should have the right to always interfere in a religion if it is discriminatory. And the easiest way to understand this is Sabarimala. After 50 or odd years of discriminatory practices where women were not allowed, women of menstrual age were not allowed into the temple, the Supreme Court set it right in 2018 by saying that this is unconstitutional.
Yeah. So, would you see this entire temple entry movement and, of course, access to the pathways around it as something which is about self-respect or equality, or what was it just about a practical need of that time? Was it equality, self-respect, or a practical need that people could, for now, okay, they're not allowing, so it's okay for us not to go that way. Uh, who made it about equality? Who made it about self-respect? And what is the history behind this?
So much before our time, temples had significant power, right? They were the epicenters of power, which is why I said over 1,000-year period, various rulers have made temple an integral part of modern South Indian society, and from there they drew great power to rule over people. So entry into a temple always signified some access to power or closeness to power. Now, over the years, this has somewhat changed. Today, there are more needs. We have to, get equality in education, equality in employment and healthcare, and so on and so forth. But temples were the sites of the earliest power centers. Now, after the governments came in, after sort of we've had the first ever somewhat indigenous government was the 1920-21 governments. And then after that, after independence, we've been electing our own governments. Now it's more important to get into positions of power through parliament and assembly.
Yeah.
But the temples were the earliest points where people associated temple with power. Second is, like I said, Periyar felt temples provided people unquestioned authority to endorse and embed discriminatory practices in society. So therefore, that also had to be challenged. Now, the whole idea of self-respect only comes, interestingly, after Vaikom. So I describe in the book that he enters the scene of Vaikom as Congress's Ramasamy, E.V. Ramasamy of the Congress, because he's deputed, he was the Madras Congress president at that point of time. The Kerala Congress, Travancore Congress leaders are all getting arrested. And when reached out, Gandhi says, no, you sort this out regionally. I cannot send a national leader for your Satyagraha. So Ramasamy comes in as the Congress's stalwart to help with the Vaikom movement, but he leaves as a Periyar because he leaves disgruntled by the outcome of Vaikom. Though Vaikom was a protest to enter the streets next to the temple,
Correct.
the protest culminated in an arrangement which was a compromise arrangement saying that you will be allowed to walk on the streets now, but you should not ask for temple entry. Periyar at that point says, but what is the point of walking on streets if we are not allowed to even enter the temple, which is our ultimate goal? So when he leaves, that sort of is the starting point or the trigger point for the self-respect movement, which coincides with Periyar leaving Congress in 1925-26 and setting up the Self-Respect League and the self-respect movement. The concept of self-respect is sort of unique because according to me, it is the most uniquely indigenous political concept in India. Of course, there are many other great political movements in India, but self-respect movement is something so unique to the southern states, the Madras presidency, and more so now in Tamil Nadu. So the idea of self-respect, according to me, was born probably in the events of the Vaikom agitation and thereafter. And it is so simple that though in constitutional terms we understand the law or right to be treated equal, self-respect says that you will not treat anybody inferior to you as if they're inferior to you, nor will you consider anybody who is superior to you. So the simplicity of the idea resonates, across caste, across gender, sexual minorities, language, religion, place of birth, and so on. So essentially, this is a self-respect movement, though it is, like I said, not very well understood beyond the 5 or 6 southern states in India.
Yeah, so since there's a lot of Periyar here, let me ask you, you talk about Periyar, even in the introduction, there is Periyar, there is Ambedkar, there is Gandhi. I want to ask you, how central were these characters, even in Vaikom or to temple entry, self-respect, all of those as an omnibus kind of thing? How important were they? Because you remember, there was, say, half a dozen assassination attempts on Mahatma Gandhi. He didn't die, thankfully. He stayed on to do the job he was ordained or destined or, naturally supposed to do, number one. And Ambedkar nearly did not make it to the as the drafter of the constitution because Nehru had other ideas. He wanted to bring in some European to do the job because the thinking at that time was that there was not enough expertise in India. Maybe there was an Ambedkar. And in fact, there is also later writing that Ambedkar was co-opted by Gandhi because of the fact that he will also bring in, his own community along with it. So this being the nature of extremely flux of of that time, the atmosphere at that time. How important were these figures? Because they had too many other things to also think of. They were in a flux all the time. So how important was their contribution in this particular issue?
So I cannot speak highly about this enough, which is that we had 3 of these giants, intellectuals, who were sort of coexisting in that as contemporaries, right?
Yeah.
So you had Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Periyar, and rarely did they intersect or work together, and their paths hardly crossed. Of course, Periyar and Gandhi had more to do because of their time in Congress. Ambedkar and Gandhi had more to do because they were sort of on a similar thread of the independence movement, and then later on around the nation building time. But Periyar Ambedkar crossed very little. But then very strikingly, they make the same kind of observations. In 1925, Periyar and 1926, Ambedkar say that the two biggest challenges are interdining and intermarriage in terms of caste, right? And it's a challenge we still continue to face in modern Indian society. So then you have, how do these three people actually intertwine in this? And I think the temple entry issues where there's a lot of overlap, because Vaikom brings Gandhi and Periyar together, and soon after Vaikom, Ambedkar embarks on the Kala Ram Mandir temple and a couple of other temple entry movements. Okay. Interestingly, Ambedkar and Periyar both get disillusioned with Gandhi. Periyar, a little ahead of Ambedkar in 1925-26, uses very choicest of words and walks out of Congress and says, I would almost go to the extent of opposing God, Brahmin, religion, Congress and Gandhi, right? And so does Ambedkar. Except Ambedkar, I think it was more around 1930, around the Pune Pact time, where he is disillusioned with Gandhi, but both of them feel Gandhi did not go far enough. And Ambedkar famously laments, he says, Congress doesn't mind giving the British a timeline to leave the country or to give us dominion status or more powers, but they do not have a timeline for when caste will be abolished or when anti-caste, equality will be brought. Similarly, Periyar also. But interesting aspect is both have also lost faith within their own religion. Both were born Hindus. Both perhaps at time were even faithful to the religion. Ambedkar famously says, though I was born a Hindu, I will not die one. And his last act before he passes away is this mass conversion to Buddhism along with around 4.5 lakh followers. Periyar is sort of what I call a born-again atheist, right? And I say this with some tongue-in-cheek because I think we're all born atheists. Yeah. No baby is born religious. So we develop a kind of religious affinity. Periyar is again, goes through religion and then comes out and says, I am now an atheist. But he never gives up the fight for temple entry. Ambedkar at one time after the Kalaram Mandir struggle, he looks at his followers and says, why are you all getting beaten up for this? In fact, Ambedkar is also beaten up by the police. And he says, why are we doing this? Are we going to get immortalized by entering this temple? What is the great deal? And see how these people are even treating us, right? Meaning these people, meaning our co-religionists. Periyar has the same disillusionment and anguish, but almost till the 1970s, when before he dies, the very last protest he announces is for the fight of equality in priesthood. He, though is not a believer, he says, I will fight for the right of every person to go in and be treated as an equal, because he saw that access to temples actually was the starting point of equality across society. So the book hopefully does justice to these three great icons and how they have sort of interplayed, within this. The last point I want to make is this. The difference is that Gandhi's view of secularism was always inter-religious secularism. Hindus, Muslims, Christians, etc. We are all sort of equal, and I mean that is the greatness of Gandhi himself. But Ambedkar, and I would say a greater deal Periyar, felt intra-religious secularism is more important, meaning that abolition of caste, meaning that within the religion of Hinduism, there should be absolute equality. And that is why in our constitution, Article 25 is structured in a way to establish not just interreligious parity, but intra-religious equality also.
Yeah, lovely. And one part you talk about, who can, who has the oversight over temples and all of that. And I think it's page 111. You say something like, no suit alleging mismanagement by trustees could be filed for a court of law. And, there has been a series of, things like this or laws or bylaws drawn up like this, which basically exonerates a set of people, even if they commit a crime. I think we see some of that today, even if there is a law, people are not being, taken to task. Now, what could you say is the basis for this? Is this based on perceived caste system, or is this based on a sense of what to say, a hierarchy that orders Indian society?
Though the book is itself a historical inquiry into many of these aspects, I am not a historian or an expert in caste, but my understanding and my reading of, Manusmriti, the loss of Manu, especially the translated version, is a lot of this was actually derived from those, right? So these kind of canons or texts which say how society should be structured, how society should function, they gave some exemptions, some immunities to certain groups, certain communities. And my book makes the point that this was further strengthened through the temples and the systems that it propagated. So this has to some extent continued, even today, it has taken us 100 years to establish a basic principle of equality, within temples, right? The right to equally co-worship, I say, is being difficult. Even today, we have only been able to appoint, and I say only with a sense of understanding of history, only non-Brahmins in the temples, right? And non-Brahmin men especially. So women are still not being appointed as priests, because that is still, something that is deprecated by the loss of Manu and others such texts. Secondly, we are not able to ensure that more wider communities, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes are brought in. So there is still a long way to go, but it has taken us 100 years to move the conversation literally from the gates of the temple to now the sanctum sanctorum, right? And partly the title of the book is a play on this, where we've always been told when we use the word sanctum sanctorum, it refers to the holiest of holy places.
Yeah.
So the way I wanted people to understand this or recast this in their mind is to say, it's not holy, it's the people's sanctum. Every person, the sanctum belongs to every person who's a believer, who's a faithful, who's a worshipper, who's a devotee. And that's how it should be for the next 50 years. But hopefully, it does not take us that long to establish that.
Manu, on the archaka's appointment itself, can this battle be fought and won in courts, or should these fights be in the minds and hearts of people? I mean, you make it. I mean, you've written extensively on the priests and how they were appointed and the judicial challenges and whatnot, and Kalaignar, what he did, all of that. So, where should this battle be? Is it a legal battle, or is it a social battle?
So the easier part, believe it or not, is the legal battle, right? Meaning,
It just took 40 years.
I know it took 40 years, but then, even today, on many issues across the board, like let's take, for example, LGBTQ rights, right? There are vast number of judgments which say, they should be treated equally, they have co-equal rights, they have, rights to live together. But these are all Supreme Court and High Court judgments and directions. Has our society accepted
Those
gay
judgments, yeah.
communities, sexual minorities as equal?
Yeah.
I would argue not.
Yeah.
So we have a saying which is that constitutional morality always runs ahead of social morality. The harder part is to convince people. Now, I again go back to another example, which is early 80s in France. The president of France, in the early 80s, Jacques Matron, he abolished death penalty by issuing an executive order overnight. That morning, the largest newspaper in France, Le Monde, carried a survey which said something like 70 to 80% still support death penalty. Of course, if you go maybe to France today and do a similar survey, you will realize that maybe that number has come down. So the one thing is some lawyer or a judge or even a legislator to pass a law, but for society to absorb and believe and accept it, it takes a long time. And some of these divisions I've argued in the book have been built and structured and reinforced over 1,000 years. So to say that we will get this done in a matter of 5 years, 10 years through court battles may not be sufficient. But then the courts of this country, especially the constitutional courts, they have a duty to abide by constitutional morality. They have a duty to ensure that that constitutional morality is diffused And that's what Ambedkar says. He says constitutional morality must be diffused through the people. So therefore, it's up to the courts to do the right thing, but then it's up to people like me included, people who are interested in writing and talking, and people who are in the sphere of politics, to actually go and tell people why this is right, and not take the easy route out and stand with what most people believe in, right?
Yeah.
Rather try to say things that maybe most people may disagree with, but what you believe is right.
Yeah, so at one point you speak about the ideology in Tamil Nadu and the space that the DMK, ADMK occupied off and on. Is this congruent with the constitutional morality that you speak of, or is it something very different or higher than even what the constitution really asks of a people to do? And secondly, of course, is this the morality, or rather the ideology of the Tamil people, or the political parties, or the state itself?
So it's a fascinating question, and maybe one that needs to be researched by historians and people who understand how culture has evolved, right? But for me, this 100-year period from 1924 to 2024, 2025 has shown two things. One, that self-respect as an ideology has actually come out and really taken force within larger South India, like the erstwhile Madras presidency. And secondly, that has had an impact, and which is less studied, and I've tried to bring it in through this book, on how the Indian constitutional framework was itself set up. And I briefly spoke about the Madras model or school of secularism, right? But beyond that, if you see the constitution, Article 25 is a very simple article. Everybody knows it as the right to freedom of religion. So if you ask any lawyer or any person who's read the constitution, they'll say, yeah, you have the right to practice and profess your own religion. So that is a great, it's an individual right. But the brilliance of Ambedkar is this. He brings in Article 25, subclause 2, where he says every individual has the right to freedom of religion, but a larger right is given to the state to interfere and pass laws to throw open Hindu public religious institutions. And this is the only place in the constitution in 1950 where the word Hindu is even used. So Ambedkar was alert to the fact that if I just give people individual rights, everybody will start saying, hey, my right is to not let you come into my house. My right is not to let her come into my temple, right? But then what is the role of the state? So this is very much captured in. So therefore, the whole ideology of self-respect, the whole ideology of equality, temple entry, what Ambedkar beautifully describes as fraternity, right?
Yeah.
The concept of fraternity, Ambedkar specifically brings into the preamble. It is done through one of the later interventions because there is equality, dignity, liberty. These are all concepts from French Revolution and other places. But he brings in fraternity to say, how will we be a nation if the two of us don't believe we are equal and we are brothers, right? In fact, Ambedkar uses this great line in November 1949. He says, you are cherishing a great delusion if you think India is a nation when we are divided by 1,000 castes. Right? This is the man who gave us our constitution. This is the day before the constitution was adopted on 25 November 1949. He stands up in the Constituent Assembly and he says, if you do not today believe we are all brothers and sisters, like fraternity is not something I can by law direct, right? No court can say now I'm giving you a writ of fraternity and everybody has to treat each other. But that is something we have to learn. But these are concepts I believe have evolved through a mix of the self-respect movement, temple entry movements, various other movements. Of course, not one diminishing the role that played by Indian National Congress in the independence movement, but there were so many other movements. That's why in almost I would put Ambedkar and Periyar on par with Gandhi for what they have done to Indian, or should I say evolution of modern Indian society than anybody else.
Yeah, now I have to come to the typical Sanghi question, which basically is that you have argued for state control over temples. Why not for churches, mosques, gurudwaras, and every other institution of worship? Why not?
So the easy answer to that is the constitution only talks about Hindu public religious institutions. Okay, and there is a distinction to be made. Nobody is going into private institutions. These are all the state-run, state-supervised institutions which are already there. the constitution gives us a mandate to look into this. Now, there are problems in all religions and places, but I would say that we need to first sort out what is happening within temples, okay? Because this is, like I said, the place, the epicenter for caste-based discrimination. Now, once we get past that, perhaps when the question arises, what about gender-based discrimination? Then you may have a case to be made against many other religions, many other communities, and so on. But by and large, I would say the reason that temples need to be our first point of inquiry is because also historically they were always controlled by the state. This is my what my study has shown. The sovereign has always supervised the sanctum, and this is not just the British or the Justice Party or the post-independence governments, all going all the way back to the Cholas. So when there has already been a involvement, and by and large temples were endowed with land, wealth, even the idols, the everything was done only from the state exchequer. These are not private funds. So now that I've said that, other communities, other religions, if they also were benefited from the largesse of the state exchequer, then they would also have to be treated equally, right? But that is not an inquiry I've made in this particular book. Perhaps that is for somebody else or me in the future to do so if this book does well.
Yeah. Lastly, you talk about the Madras model. I want to come back to that for a moment and ask you. You have said that what happens from now for the next will decide what happens to the Madras model itself. So, given what has been happening in the Indian polity, in the Indian society itself, would you want to hazard a guess as to where the Madras model is headed, and why would you ascribe it in such a way?
So, like I said, the period between 1923 and 1947, I find so many interesting instances which have contributed to what we now define as secularism. Within the Madras Presidency and the Kingdom of Travancore, starting from the Vaikom movement to the Travancore Proclamation or Temple Entry in 1936, to various interventions in the Madras Presidency Legislative Assembly in 1939, up to the Temple Entry Act in 1947. Bear in mind, this came prior to the constitution declaring, all public Hindu religious institutions should be thrown open. Madras had been a forerunner in ensuring that there was already temple entry, right? So there was a huge push for this. And that is why I believe today our secularism is not just interreligious, it's also intra-religious within the domain of Hinduism. Now, we are at an interesting point. After 1950, after the advent of the constitution, we have seen this movement go from temple entry to appointment of archakas. Two present issues are sub judice. One, the appointment of archakas in states like Tamil Nadu, which is one of the very few states where non-Brahmins and people from all other castes, but limited to men, have been appointed. These are all now pending challenge in Supreme Court. So how the court deals with appointment or equality in appointment is something that we will know in the next year or so. Secondly, the Sabarimala judgment, which was historic, a landmark 5-judge bench in 2018, said that women cannot be denied entry just because of their gender and on the basis of notions of purity and pollution based on the idea of menstruation. This entire judgment has now been reviewed and
Correct.
sent to a reference by a 9-judge bench, which heard this in toto in the month of April and has reserved judgment. So again, this will determine how the future of not just Indian secularism, which I say is derived from the Madras school of thought, how this will play out in the next 5 to 10 years. If Sabarimala is reversed to the point, right? Because the primary argument was, can a state go and interfere and tell a particular religious denomination how to conduct their affairs? So the argument made from the Sabarimala case was, the Ayyappa Bhakts, the Ayyappa devotees are a particular religious denomination. It is their paramount belief that women of a menstrual age should not come in to the temple precincts, right?
Yeah.
So this is a key question of what is called essential religious practice doctrine. So how this will be decided will have a huge effect on how other states, other temples are also going to be governed, whether they will be opened on the basis of equality of access, dignity and freedom, or whether there will still be some carve out saying no, certain things we cannot, even state should not interfere. So we are at a very pivotal stage in that. And secondly, this will then have a cascading effect on the appointment of archakas. Now, because of the state's authority to interfere, we have the power to appoint archakas in state-run temples, especially in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and so on. If that is further curtailed, or if it is left untouched, that will also have a huge bearing on how our own concept of Hinduism, whether it is something that is an equal in every spirit kind of religion, or it is a religion still with some hierarchical structure, is something we will know perhaps in the next 1 to 2 years. And according to me, that will be one of the pivotal questions affecting us as a nation. I'm sure everybody who writes a book feels that what they've written about is the most important thing, but the fabric of secularism that we have so far enjoyed, which was stitched and weaved in so assiduously by Ambedkar and others, I think it's at a testing point now. Whether we survive as a nation based on the constitutional values left behind by Ambedkar and others, or is this going to be the start of a different kind of a way we look at religious interactions and dynamic? I think in the next 2 years, courts will let us know. But having said that, I do feel a greater responsibility is with society itself, right? Courts are ultimately also only representatives of what society wants, and I mean, judges come from our own society. So therefore, what society does believe in, how society looks at each other, and how we treat each other within our own religion, across religion, I think ultimately that is what will define us as who we are as a nation, and whether we survive Ambedkar's great question. Are we deluding ourselves that we are indeed a nation or not?
Thank you so much, Manuraj. On that note, I encourage everybody to read People's Sanctum, which is a book which is of significant relevance for today's people. And given the fact that religion occupies center stage in all the relationships that we undertake and all the conversations that we have with one another. Thank you so much.